The salt spray was a constant ghost, clinging to her hair, her clothes, the rough skin of her hands. Sigrid had lived by the sea her entire life, but since the uprising, the ocean felt less like a cradle and more like a cage. It was a gray, unforgiving barrier, hemming them into this forgotten strip of coast, this final, crumbling bastion of the old kingdom. Her fingers were raw, the cold of the morning seeping into her bones as she hauled the two heavy buckets. Sloshing inside was a foul-smelling slurry of fish guts and kitchen scraps, the day's refuse from the garrison's cookhouse. It was a servant's work. It was her work. She was a nobody. A shadow in the halls of what was once a lord's summer palace, now a barracks for the Wolf Guard, the enforcers of the new Alpha, Lord Valerius. She kept her head down, her eyes on the stone floors she scrubbed, and made herself as small and unnoticeable as a mouse in the walls. Invisibility was survival, but every morning she did something that was not invisible. Something dangerous. Instead of taking the path to the middens behind the kitchens, she veered left, toward the crumbling sea wall and the treacherous path that snaked down the cliffs. The wind picked up here, a mournful howl that whipped her thin cloak around her legs. It sliced like claws, cold and sharp. The guards at the wall post knew her routine. They watched her with a mixture of pity and contempt. They never stopped her. No one wanted the job she had taken upon herself. No one else dared. "Going to feed the monsters, little mouse?" One of them, a stout man named Jorund, called out. His laughter was a harsh bark, quickly stolen by the wind. Sigrid didn't answer. She didn't look at him. Answering drew attention. Attention was a currency she could not afford to spend. She just pulled her hood tighter and kept walking, her worn leather boots finding sure footing on the slippery stones. Down below, where the sea churned against black, jagged rocks, were the sea caves. And in the caves lived the war beasts. They were not monsters, not to her. They were the last remnants of the fallen king. Sky worms. Great feathered serpents with wings like tattered sails and eyes the color of storms. They had been King Soren's pride, his ultimate weapons, hatched and raised to answer his call alone. When he fell, they had retreated to these caves, refusing to be tamed or even approached by the soldiers of Valerius. At first, the new lord's men had tried to kill them, but the sky worms were too fast, too vicious, their shrieks echoing the very fury of the sea. They had torn apart 3 of Valerius's best hunters before the new regime decided it was easier to simply let them starve. An edict was passed. Anyone caught feeding the beasts would be flogged. Sigrid had heard their cries on the wind, pained, hungry, and utterly alone. It was a sound that mirrored the hollow ache in her own chest. She too was alone, an orphan, a drudge, a ghost in a world that had forgotten her. And so, she had started stealing the scraps. 1 bucket became 2. Her heart hammered against her ribs every single morning, a frantic drum of terror. But the thought of their suffering was worse than the thought of the lash. She reached the mouth of the largest cave. The air grew thick with the scent of brine, saltpeter, and something wilder, something reptilian and ancient. A low growl rumbled from the darkness, a sound that would have sent any sane person fleeing. Sigrid's fear was a cold knot in her stomach, but she forced her legs to move. "It's me," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the crashing waves. "I've brought you food." 2 massive heads emerged from the gloom. Their scales were the color of slate, their feathered manes a dull, listless gray. Their eyes, once bright as lightning, were clouded with despair. They were magnificent and broken. She saw herself in them. She set the buckets down and backed away, keeping her movements slow and small. They approached with caution, their long, serpentine bodies uncoiling from the shadows. They were starving. She could see their ribs beneath their hides. They fell upon the scraps with a desperate hunger that made her own stomach clench in sympathy. She watched them, a strange sense of peace settling over her. Here, in this cave, with these forgotten creatures, she was not invisible. She was necessary. It was a feeling so foreign it was almost painful. "You are a foolish girl." The voice came from behind her, deep and rough as stones grinding together. Sigrid froze, her blood turning to ice. She hadn't heard him approach. The waves, the wind, her own focus, it had all masked his footsteps. She turned slowly, her heart seizing in her chest. A man stood there, silhouetted against the gray light of the cave mouth. He was tall and broad, wrapped in a tattered dark cloak that did little to hide the sheer size of him. His face was in shadow, but she could feel the weight of his gaze on her, heavy as a mountain. It wasn't a guard. She knew all their faces, their gaits. This man was a stranger, and strangers in this territory were never a good thing. "They could tear you limb from limb," he said, his voice quiet, yet it carried over the roar of the sea with an unnerving authority. Sigrid found her voice, though it came out as a trembling whisper. "They're hungry. So are the wolves in the forest. Do you feed them too?" She shook her head, unable to look away from the intimidating shape of him. Fear was a physical thing, a pressure in her throat. He took a step into the cave and the weak light caught the planes of his face. He was haggard, with a thick, untrimmed beard and lines of exhaustion carved around his eyes. But even through the grime and weariness, there was a harsh, undeniable beauty to him, like a weathered cliff face. His eyes were the most startling thing, a pale, piercing gray, the color of a winter sky. "This is a death sentence if you're caught," he stated, not as a threat, but as a fact. "I know," she whispered. He looked past her, at the two sky worms who had paused their feeding to watch him, a low hiss rumbling in their chests. The man made a soft sound, a guttural click in the back of his throat. To Sigrid's astonishment, the hissing stopped. The beasts lowered their heads and resumed eating, but they kept glancing toward him, a flicker of something. Recognition? Hope? In their clouded eyes. Who was he? He turned his attention back to her. "Why?" he asked, the single word sharp as a shard of ice. "Why do you do this?" Sigrid hugged her arms around herself, a futile attempt to stop her trembling. She had no grand answer. No speech about loyalty to the old king or defiance against the new. She only had the truth. "Because no one else would," she said simply. "Because I know what it feels like to be left to starve." The man's expression didn't change, but something in the hard set of his jaw seemed to soften, just for a fraction of a second. He studied her for a long moment, his gray eyes seeming to see right through her thin cloak, through her skin, into the very marrow of her bones. It was a terrifying, invasive scrutiny. He was reading her, she realized. Reading her history of hunger and loneliness in the stoop of her shoulders and the fear in her eyes. "Go back to the castle," he said finally, his voice flat, "and don't come back here. It's not safe." "But they'll starve." "That is not your concern." His voice was absolute, the voice of a man used to being obeyed. But Sigrid, who had been obedient her entire life, found a spark of defiance. It was small, but it was there, fanned by the sight of the weakened worms. "It is my concern," she said, her voice gaining a sliver of strength. "They serve the king. They don't deserve this." At the mention of the king, a shadow crossed the man's face, a flicker of such profound pain that it stole her breath. It was a raw, ancient grief, a wound torn open. He said nothing more. He simply turned and melted back into the deeper shadows of the cave, disappearing as if he had never been there at all. Sigrid stood frozen, her heart racing. The encounter left her more shaken than any threat of a flogging. There was a power in that man, a deep, wounded authority that frightened her more than any soldier's sword. She didn't listen to him. The next morning, she returned with the buckets. And the morning after that. The man was always there, a silent sentinel in the shadows, watching her. He never spoke to her again, but his presence was a constant weight at the edge of her awareness. Sometimes she would see him lay a hand on the snout of one of the worms, murmuring to it in a low tone she couldn't understand. One day, a week after their first meeting, she was leaving the caves when she heard a shout from the path above. "You! Hold there!" Sigrid's blood ran cold. It was Captain Hrolf, the commander of the Wolfguard garrison, a man whose cruelty was legendary. He was flanked by two of his soldiers, their faces set in hard lines. They were blocking her path. "I've been hearing tales about a little kitchen maid with a soft spot for the fallen king's pets," Hrolf said, his voice dripping with mock sweetness. He was a large, florid man with a sneer permanently etched on his lips. "Emptying the garrison's scraps for monsters, are we?" I was just dumping them in the sea," she stammered, the lie thin and useless on her tongue. Hrolf laughed. "The sea? The path to the middens is the other way, girl. Don't take me for a fool." He stepped closer, crowding her against the cliff edge. The drop to the rocks below was dizzying. "The edict is clear. The punishment is a public flogging." Tears of terror pricked at Sigrid's eyes. She could already feel the bite of the lash, the shame of being stripped and beaten before the entire garrison. "Please," she begged, "I won't do it again." "Oh, I know you won't," Hrolf said, his smile widening. "But rules are rules." He gestured to his men. "Take her." As the soldiers reached for her, a blur of motion erupted from the mouth of the cave. The stranger. He moved with a speed that was utterly inhuman, a whirlwind of gray rags and coiled fury. Before Hrolf or his men could even draw their swords, the man was on them. He didn't use a weapon. He used his hands, his fists, his feet. He moved like a predator, with a brutal efficiency that was terrifying to behold. He broke one soldier's arm with a sharp crack that echoed over the waves. He sent the other tumbling down the path with a powerful kick to the chest. Then he turned to Captain Hrolf. The captain, for all his bluster, was pale with shock and fear. He fumbled for his sword, but the stranger was too fast. He grabbed Hrolf's wrist, and Sigrid heard the sickening crunch of bone. The sword clattered to the stone path. Hrolf screamed a high, thin sound of agony. The stranger leaned in close, his voice a low, lethal growl that was more frightening than any shout. "You will not touch her. You will not speak to her. You will forget you ever saw her on this path. If I ever see you near her again, I will throw you to the worms myself. Do you understand?" Hrolf, cradling his shattered wrist, could only nod, his eyes wide with terror. "Go," the man commanded. The captain scrambled away, half running, half falling up the path, his remaining soldier helping him. The stranger stood watching them go, his chest heaving. Then he turned to Sigrid. The feral rage was gone from his eyes, replaced by that familiar, weary pain. He looked at her, then at his own hands, as if surprised by what they had done. "You're hurt," she whispered, seeing a long, bloody gash on his forearm where one of the soldiers must have caught him with a dagger. He glanced at it, dismissing it. "It's nothing." "It's not nothing. It will fester if it's not cleaned." Without thinking, driven by some instinct she didn't know she possessed, she reached out and took his arm. His skin was cold, shockingly cold, but the muscles beneath were like steel cables. He flinched at her touch, a barely perceptible tremor. He started to pull away. "Let me help you," she insisted, her voice quiet but firm. "You helped me. Let me help you." He stared at her, his gray eyes searching her face. The fight seemed to drain out of him, leaving behind a profound exhaustion. He gave a slow, almost imperceptible nod. She led him not into the main cave, but to a smaller hidden fissure in the rock she had found weeks ago. It led to a tiny, dry cavern, sheltered from the wind. It was her secret place. She had a small stash there, a flint and steel, a few dried herbs, and clean rags she'd pilfered from the laundry. He sat heavily on a rock as she worked, his silence a heavy blanket in the small space. She cleaned the wound with a rag dipped in seawater, her touch as gentle as she could make it. He bore her ministration without a sound, but she could feel the tension in him, the tight control he exerted over his own body. "What is your name?" he asked, his voice rough. "Sigrid." "Sigrid," he repeated, the name tasting strange on his tongue. He fell silent again as she crushed some yarrow leaves and pressed them to the gash to staunch the bleeding, binding it with a clean strip of linen. "Who are you?" she asked softly, her curiosity finally overpowering her fear. He was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. "I am no one," he said finally, the words laced with a bitterness that chilled her. "A ghost." "Ghosts don't bleed," she countered, tying off the bandage. Her fingers brushed against his skin and a strange jolt went through her, a flicker of warmth against his unnatural cold. He jerked his arm back as if burned. "You should not have done that," he said, his voice strained. He stood up, towering over her in the cramped space. "You need to stay away from me. I bring nothing but ruin." "You saved me," she insisted, looking up at him. "Hrolf would have—" She couldn't finish the sentence. "And now he will be watching you," the man said, his jaw tight with a self-loathing so potent it was almost a physical force. "He will connect you to me. You are in more danger now than you were before." He was right. She knew he was right, but as she looked at him, at the profound loneliness in his winter-gray eyes, the deep, soul-crushing guilt that seemed to radiate from him, she felt no fear. Only a deep, aching pull of compassion. "I'm not afraid," she lied. A harsh, humorless sound escaped his lips. "You should be." He turned to leave the small cavern. "Wait," she called out. "Your name. You know mine. It's only fair." He paused at the entrance, his back to her. The silence stretched. "Soren," he said, the name a ragged whisper torn from his throat. Then he was gone. Soren. The name echoed in her mind. It was a common enough name, but she had only ever heard it in one context. King Soren. The Alpha King who had ruled for a century, who had commanded the sky worms, who had been betrayed and killed in the uprising led by Lord Valerius. It couldn't be. The king was dead. Everyone knew that. His body had been paraded through the capital. But the way the worms responded to him, the authority in his voice, the profound grief that clung to him like a shroud, her mind reeled. If he was the king, what was he doing here? Hiding in a cave, dressed in rags. What had happened to him? And what was this terrible guilt that was eating him alive? Her world, which had been small and gray and simple, had just fractured into 1,000 bewildering pieces. She continued her routine, but everything had changed. The daily trip to the caves was no longer just about the worms. It was about him. About Soren. He was always there, a brooding shadow. He rarely spoke, but she felt his eyes on her constantly. She started bringing extra food, not just scraps, but a small loaf of bread or a piece of cheese stolen from the pantry, leaving it on a rock for him. He never acknowledged the gesture, but the food was always gone when she returned the next day. The caretaking shifted. It became less about the gash on his arm and more about the wound in his soul. She would talk to him, filling the silence with simple stories about her day, about the other servants, the gossip in the kitchens. She didn't expect him to respond. It was enough to see the tension in his shoulders ease, just slightly, as he listened. One evening, a storm rolled in off the sea, a true monster of a gale that rattled the very stones of the castle. She knew the caves would be flooded, that the worms and Soren would be driven out into the open. The thought of him, alone and exposed in the lashing rain, was unbearable. Under the cover of the storm's fury, she slipped out of the castle. The wind was a physical blow, tearing at her cloak, and the rain was a blinding, freezing sheet. She fought her way down the slick path, calling his name into the gale. She found him huddled in the lee of a great black boulder, shivering. His cloak was soaked through, and his face was pale and drawn. The unnatural cold she'd felt on his skin seemed to be emanating from him now, a palpable aura of frost. "Soren!" she cried, scrambling to his side. He looked up, his eyes dazed with cold and something else. Pain. "You should not be here," he rasped, his teeth chattering. "You'll die out here," she shouted over the wind. "Come with me." He shook his head. "I can't. I can't go back there. Not to the castle. I know a place." She grabbed his arm, pulling him to his feet. He was heavy, his movements sluggish. He leaned on her as she guided him away from the cliffs, inland, toward a cluster of abandoned shepherds' huts that dotted the high moors. The hut was little more than 4 crumbling stone walls and a leaky thatch roof, but it was shelter. She got him inside, out of the wind, and used her flint and steel on a small pile of dry kindling she'd gathered on her walks. A tiny, sputtering flame sprang to life. In the flickering firelight, she saw how bad he truly was. His lips were blue. A violent tremor racked his body, a deep internal shivering that seemed to come from his very bones. "Your cloak," she said, her voice commanding. "It's soaked. You need to get it off." He fumbled with the clasp, his fingers too numb to work it. She pushed his hands away and undid it herself, her knuckles brushing the cold, hard muscle of his chest. She pulled the sodden wool from his shoulders. Beneath it, he wore a simple linen tunic, also soaked and clinging to his powerful frame. "The tunic, too," she said, her voice softer now. He looked at her, and in his eyes she saw a flash of sheer, desperate vulnerability. This was the Alpha King, a man who had commanded armies, and he was helpless before her. The thought didn't empower her. It filled her with a fierce, protective ache. He managed to pull the tunic over his head. His torso was a road map of old scars, pale white lines against his skin. But there were other marks, too. Dark, vein-like patterns spreading from his heart, like black frost creeping under his skin. They seemed to pulse with a faint, sickly light. "What is that?" she whispered in horror. He flinched, trying to cover his chest. "It is my penance," he growled, the words torn from him. "The price for what I did." "What did you do?" He sank to the floor by the fire, wrapping his arms around himself, but the shaking didn't stop. "I killed them," he whispered, his voice cracking. "My pack, my family, the uprising. It wasn't just Valerius. It was a civil war, brother against brother. I gave an order I thought would end the fighting quickly, save lives." He squeezed his eyes shut, a tear tracing a path through the grime on his cheek. "It was a trap. Valerius knew I would choose to protect the innocents in the city. He used them as bait. My guard, my blood sworn, they walked into an ambush. Hundreds of them, the best of our people, slaughtered. Because of my pride, because of my mistake." The guilt he carried was not a metaphor. It was a living thing, a curse he had brought upon himself. The black frost on his skin was its physical manifestation. "The cold," she realized aloud. "It's the curse." He nodded, his body racked by another violent shudder. "It feeds on my regret, my shame. It has been slowly consuming me, but now—" He looked at her, his gaze filled with a terrible, dawning horror. "Since it's getting worse. Faster." Her acts of kindness, her compassion. They were a balm to his spirit, but they were poison to his cursed body. By making him feel something other than guilt, gratitude, connection, warmth, she was forcing the curse to fight back harder, to reclaim its territory. "Feeling anything. It makes the cold burn," he rasped. "And what I feel when you are near, it's going to kill me." The revelation struck her like a physical blow. Her attempts to heal him were destroying him. "Then I'll go," she said, her heart breaking. "I'll leave. I won't come near you again." "No," he said, the word a desperate plea. He reached out, his hand hovering just inches from her arm, afraid to touch her. "Don't. Your presence. It's the only warmth I have left. I would rather burn alive in it than freeze alone in the dark." This was the moment, the turning point. She could walk away, back to her safe, gray life of invisibility. Or she could stay. She could stay and face this curse with him, even if it meant watching him die. She looked at the firelight dancing in his haunted eyes, at the lines of pain etched onto his face, at the man who had been a king and was now nothing, and she knew there was no choice at all. She moved closer to the fire, sitting beside him, not touching, but sharing the small circle of warmth. "I'm not leaving you, Soren," she said softly. And for the first time, in the flickering light of a stolen fire, in a ruined hut in the middle of a storm, she saw the ghost of a smile touch the lips of the fallen king. It was the saddest, most beautiful thing she had ever seen. The storm passed, but a new one was gathering on the horizon. News arrived like a foul wind from the capital. Lord Valerius was consolidating his power, but the coastal territories remained stubbornly loyal to the memory of their lost king. Whispers were spreading. Whispers of sky worms being seen again. Whispers of a ghost who fought like a demon on the cliffside paths. Valerius could not afford loose ends. He could not afford hope to fester in this final holdout. And so, he sent his most trusted and ruthless agent to quell the rumors and crush the resistance. He sent the woman who had helped him plan the uprising, the woman whose jealousy of the king's late queen had curdled into a vicious, burning hatred for his entire line. He sent Lady Anya. Her arrival was announced by the thunder of hooves and the gleam of polished steel. She rode into the garrison at the head of 100 elite soldiers, her banner, a black wolf on a field of blood red, snapping in the wind. She was beautiful in the way a perfect poisoned dart is beautiful. Sigrid watched from a high window in the laundry, her stomach twisting into a knot of dread. She had heard stories of Lady Anya, of her cruelty and her ambition. They said she had hoped to be Soren's queen, and when he had chosen another, her love had twisted into an obsession with his destruction. Anya's presence changed everything. The lax atmosphere of the garrison vanished, replaced by a brittle, fearful tension. Patrols were doubled. Hrolf, his arm now in a sling and his face a mask of vengeful fury, was at her side constantly, whispering in her ear. Sigrid knew what he was whispering about. A little kitchen maid, a mysterious vagrant. She had to warn Soren. That night, she slipped out, her heart a frantic bird in her chest. She found him not in the caves, but on a high tor overlooking the sea, watching the distant lights of the garrison. The black frost on his skin was more pronounced, creeping up his neck toward his jaw. "She's here," Sigrid said, her voice breathless. "Lady Anya." Soren's entire body went rigid. He didn't need to ask who that was. The name hung in the air between them, thick with the poison of betrayal. "I know," he said, his voice a low growl. "I can smell her ambition on the wind, like rot." He turned to her, his face grim. "Sigrid, you cannot be here. You cannot be seen with me. She will not just flog you. She will tear you apart to get to me." "I'm not leaving you to face her alone," she said stubbornly. "This is not a choice," he roared, and the force of it made her flinch. It was the king's voice, the Alpha's command, full of thunder and power, but it was laced with desperation. "I am trying to save your life." As the rage and fear surged in him, he cried out, clutching his chest. The black veins on his skin pulsed with a virulent light, and he stumbled, falling to one knee. A gasp of icy air escaped his lips. "Soren!" She rushed to his side, ignoring his warning. "Don't touch me." He gasped, the words coated in pain. It's the anger, the fear. It feeds the curse. And caring for you, wanting to protect you, that's the worst of it. He looked up at her, his eyes filled with agonizing self-recrimination. My love is poison, Sigrid. It is my final failure. It will be the death of me. I don't believe that, she said fiercely, tears welling in her eyes. I won't. You must, he said, his voice weakening. Go. Run. Hide where she can't find you, please. It is the only thing you can do for me now. He wanted to save her, even now, as his own body was being consumed by a curse fueled by his own emotions. His only thought was for her safety. The realization was a spear through her heart. Before she could answer, a shout echoed from the base of the tor. There! Up there! Torchlight flared below, a swarm of angry fireflies. Hrolf's voice, triumphant and vicious, cut through the night. We have him! The king is ours! Anya's soldiers began to swarm the hill. They were trapped. Soren struggled to his feet, his movements stiff and pained. He pushed Sigrid behind him. Run! He commanded, his voice low and guttural. To the sea caves. Call the worms. They will not obey me in this state. But you fed them. They may listen to you. Go. He turned to face the advancing soldiers, a king once more, albeit a broken one. He stood alone on a desolate hill, ready to face an army for her. Sigrid's feet felt rooted to the ground. Leave him? Flee while he died for her? The thought was a violation of everything she was, everything she had become. But the look in his eyes, the desperate, commanding plea, broke through her paralysis. He wasn't asking her to save herself. He was giving her a mission. She turned and ran. The soldiers were focused on Soren. They saw her as nothing, a fleeing servant girl. It was the mistake they always made. She scrambled down the dark side of the tor, her lungs burning, tears streaming down her face. She ran for the cliffs, for the only hope they had. The battle began behind her, the clash of steel, the shouts of men. She didn't look back. She couldn't. She reached the caves, her voice raw as she screamed the names she had given the worms. Tempest! Gale! For a heart-stopping moment there was only the sound of the waves. Then a shriek answered her from the darkness. The two sky worms, larger and stronger now thanks to her care, emerged from the cave, their eyes glowing with a fierce intelligence. But as they prepared to launch into the sky, a new sound reached them. A child's scream. Sigrid's head snapped toward the direction of the village, a small collection of huts nestled in a cove not far from the cliffs. A detachment of Anya's soldiers had broken off, and under Hrolf's command, they were terrorizing the villagers, trying to flush out any other loyalists. Through a gap in the rocks, she could see them. They had cornered a small family. Hrolf had a little girl, no older than 7, by the arm, his sword at her throat. Tell me where the others are hiding, he bellowed at the girl's weeping mother. The world went silent for Sigrid. All she could see was that child. All she could feel was a white-hot surge of rage so pure, so absolute, it burned away her fear, her sorrow, her doubt. It was the injustice of it, the strong preying on the weak, the cruelty for cruelty's sake, the same force that had left her an orphan, that had left the worms to starve, that was now killing the king she had come to love. And in that moment of pure, incandescent fury, something inside her broke. It was not a choice. It was an eruption, a dam of power she never knew existed bursting forth. The air around her crackled. The ground beneath her feet trembled. She felt a connection not just to the sea, but to the water in the air, in the earth, in the very blood of her enemies. She raised a hand, not knowing what she was doing, only that she had to stop him. From the sea, a colossal wave rose up, a towering wall of black water and churning foam. It did not crash. It held, poised, utterly silent, obeying a command she had not known she could give. On the tor, Soren felt it. a surge of raw elemental power that resonated with the sea and the sky. He staggered, not from a blow, but from the sheer shock of it. He turned his head, his eyes searching the darkness in the direction Sigrid had run. Hrolf and his men stared at the monstrous wave in disbelief and terror. Hrolf dropped the child, his jaw slack with horror. "Stop!" Sigrid's voice commanded. It was no longer a whisper. It was amplified by the wind and the sea, the voice of the storm itself. The wave crashed down. But it didn't hit the village. With a flick of her will, she split the torrent, sending two massive plumes of water smashing into the cliffs on either side of the cove, bracketing the soldiers in a deluge of spray and terror. They were soaked, battered, their torches extinguished, their formation broken. The little girl ran to her mother. The villagers stared at Sigrid, who now stood at the edge of the cliff, her thin dress and cloak whipping around her in a wind she alone commanded. She looked like a goddess of vengeance. Anya, watching from the base of the tor, saw the display of power. Her eyes widened, first in shock, then in avaricious glee. A weapon, a new, powerful weapon. "Forget the king!" she screamed at her personal guard. "Bring me the girl!" Soren saw their target shift. He saw them charging toward Sigrid. He let out a roar of pure fury and despair. He fought with the last of his strength, cutting down two of Anya's guards who tried to get past him. But he was too weak. The curse was consuming him. A soldier slipped past his guard, then another. They were racing toward an unsuspecting Sigrid, who was still focused on Hrolf's routed men. "Sigrid!" Soren's warning cry was a ragged tear in the night. He pushed himself to run, to intercept them, but the effort was too much. The black frost flared, encasing his heart in ice. He collapsed, his sword falling from his numb fingers. The world dissolved into a vortex of pain and freezing darkness. He was dying. He knew it. His last conscious thought was of her name. Sigrid heard his cry. She turned just in time to see him fall. The sight broke her. The rage that had fueled her power vanished, replaced by a wave of soul-shattering grief. The wind died. The sea calmed. The power receded, leaving her empty and terribly human. Anya's guards were almost upon her, but then the air was filled with a pair of piercing shrieks. Tempest and gale, their duty to the child fulfilled, now answered the call of their master's pain. They dove from the cliffs, not as starving beasts, but as the weapons they were born to be. They fell upon Anya's men with beak and talon, a whirlwind of feathers and fury. The attack bought her time. Sigrid ran, not away, but toward Soren. She fell to her knees beside his body on the cold, damp earth. He was frighteningly still. The black frost had covered his entire chest and was creeping up his throat. His skin was colder than stone. There was no breath. No heartbeat. "No," she whispered. The word a raw, broken thing. "No, I will not let you." She had felt power surge through her, the power of the storm. But now, as she looked at the man she loved, she felt another power welling up. Not rage, not fury. It was something quiet, deep, and warm. It was the love he thought was a poison. She placed her hands on his chest over the epicenter of the black frost. She closed her eyes and poured every ounce of her will, her love, her life force into him. "You called my love a poison," she whispered to his still form, tears flowing freely now, dripping onto his icy skin. "But you were wrong. It's the antidote." A light began to glow from beneath her hands, not the crackling blue-white of lightning, but a soft, steady golden warmth. It was the light of a sunrise after a long, dark winter. The black frost hissed and recoiled from her touch, melting away like snow in spring. Anya watched from below, her face a mask of fury. Her soldiers were being torn apart by the worms. The peasant girl was glowing with some new magic, and the king was not staying dead. "Kill them both!" she shrieked, her voice thin with hysteria. "Fire! Use the archers!" But it was too late. A collective gasp went through the local villagers and the remaining loyalist soldiers who had rallied. Soren's chest rose with a sharp, shuddering intake of breath. His eyes snapped open. They were no longer the color of a winter sky. They were molten gold. He looked at Sigrid, at her hands on his chest, at the golden light pouring from her, at the tears on her face. He saw it all. Her power, her sacrifice, her love. "Sigrid," he breathed, and his voice was clear, free of the ragged pain of the curse. He sat up, his movement still stiff, but the killing cold was gone. The black veins were fading, leaving behind clean, unblemished skin. Her love hadn't just saved him, it had cleansed him. He looked at her, and the awe and love in his eyes was so potent it was a physical force. "I love you," he said, the words clear and certain in the chaos of the battle. "And it's the only thing that has ever made me whole." He got to his feet, pulling her up with him. He was weak, but he was alive. He was no longer a ghost. He was a king, reborn in the light of her love. He looked at the battle raging below, at Anya's panicked face, and then at the two skyworms circling overhead. He raised his head and let out a call. Not a shout, but a deep, resonant cry that was pure alpha command. It was the call his worms had been waiting a year to hear. They answered, their shrieks triumphant. They dove, not with wild fury, but with disciplined purpose, herding Anya's forces, driving them back toward the garrison, their attacks precise and disabling. Soren held Sigrid's hand, his grip tight and grounding. "It's not over," he said, his golden eyes fixed on Anya's retreating form. "But now, we face her together." The battle for the coast was short and decisive, with Soren revealed to be alive and the local populace rising up with a ferocity born of long-suppressed loyalty. Anya's forces crumbled. Hrolf was captured by the villagers he had terrorized, and his fate was swift and just. Anya, however, managed to escape with a handful of her personal guard, fleeing back toward the capital to warn Lord Valerius that the Ghost King had returned, and he had a storm at his side. In the aftermath, Soren and Sigrid stood on the tor, the sun now rising, painting the sea in hues of rose and gold. The land was quiet, breathing a collective sigh of relief. Soren was still weak, but the curse was broken. The guilt remained, a scar on his soul, but it no longer had power over him. It was a memory, a lesson, not a cage. He looked at Sigrid, at her face smudged with dirt and tears, her hair wild from the wind she had commanded. He had never seen anyone more beautiful. "They are calling you the Storm Witch," he said softly. She looked down at her hands, a flicker of her old fear and uncertainty in her eyes. "I don't know what I am." He gently took her hands in his, lifting her chin so she would look at him. "I know what you are," he said, his voice filled with a reverence that humbled her. "You are my queen." It wasn't a proposal, it was a statement of fact, a truth the world had not yet learned. She stared at him, her heart too full for words. A servant girl, a nobody, a queen. It was impossible. But looking into his golden eyes, she knew it was her destiny. "Valerius will not let this stand," she said, her voice finding its strength. "He will come for you. For us." "Let him come," Soren said, a dangerous fire lighting his eyes. "He took my kingdom through treachery and deceit. I will take it back with a storm and a prayer." He squeezed her hand. "With you." The next few months were a blur of activity. The coastal territory became their fortress. Soren, his strength returning day by day, retrained the local levies, his strategic brilliance undimmed. Sigrid, with Soren's patient guidance, began to explore her power. She learned it was tied to her emotions, that the rage had brought the wave, but love had brought the healing light. She learned to feel the currents of the sea, the moisture in the air, to call the mist and calm the winds. The sky worms became her constant companions, their bond with her as strong as their bond with Soren. They were a strange pair to lead a rebellion, the fallen king and the kitchen maid who could command the weather. But their people did not see that. They saw a king who had returned from the dead, his heart healed by a woman whose power was the very soul of their coastal home. They saw hope. The final confrontation came not on a battlefield, but at the gates of the capital. Valerius, his army bolstered by mercenaries, marched out to meet them. Anya was at his side, her face a pale mask of hatred, her eyes fixed on Sigrid. Soren's army was smaller, but they were fighting for their homes, for their king. And they had allies Valerius could never have imagined. As the armies faced each other across the field, Sigrid raised her hands. A thick, impenetrable fog rolled in from the coast, miles away, blanketing the field in a gray shroud. Valerius's army, trained for open warfare, fell into confusion. His archers were useless. His cavalry couldn't charge what they couldn't see. Through the fog, the shrieks of the skyworms echoed sowing terror. Soren's soldiers, accustomed to the mists of their home, moved like ghosts, striking and fading back into the gloom. Soren himself sought out Valerius. The two alphas met in the swirling mist, a personal combat to end the war. Their fight was brutal, a clash of power and history. But Valerius fought for a throne he had stolen. Soren fought for the woman who had saved his soul. It was no contest. Soren disarmed him, his sword at Valerius's throat. "It's over," he said, his voice echoing in the mist. At the same time, Sigrid faced Anya. The jealous woman charged her, a dagger in her hand, her face twisted in a snarl of rage. "He was mine," she screamed. "The throne was mine." Sigrid didn't raise a wave. She didn't call a wind. She simply stood her ground. As Anya lunged, Sigrid whispered a single word: "Calm." A gentle rain began to fall, washing the dirt and blood from the field. It touched Anya's face, and the burning fury in her eyes guttered, replaced by a sudden, shocking clarity. The obsession that had driven her for years seemed to wash away, leaving behind only the empty, bitter shell of a woman who had destroyed herself for nothing. She dropped the dagger, falling to her knees, her shoulders shaking with silent, empty sobs. With Valerius defeated and Anya broken, the will to fight evaporated from their army. The kingdom was Soren's again. 6 months later, Sigrid stood on the high balcony of the royal palace, looking out over the peaceful city. She wore a simple gown of sea-green silk, and the crown on her head was a simple circlet of silver, but no one in the kingdom doubted who she was. Soren came to stand behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist. He rested his chin on her shoulder, his warmth a familiar comfort. The curse was a distant memory, and his eyes were a constant, steady gold. "What are you thinking about?" he asked softly. "Fish guts," she said, a small smile playing on her lips. "And how heavy the buckets were." He chuckled, a deep, warm sound. "I should have the royal historians record that. The foundations of our new kingdom, fish guts and stubbornness." She leaned back against him, her heart full. "They were hungry," she said, thinking of the worms, of him, of herself. "It's as simple as that." "Nothing about you has ever been simple, my love," he murmured, pressing a kiss to her temple. Down below in the courtyard, 2 young sky worms, the offspring of tempest and gale, were playing with a group of children, their shrieks full of joy, not pain. The beasts of war had become the companions of a peaceful kingdom. Sigrid turned in his arms, her hands coming up to cup his face. The man who had been a ghost, who had thought his love was a poison, looked at her with an adoration that was still, after all this time, enough to take her breath away. "I am glad I was foolish then," she whispered. "I thank the gods for your foolishness every day," he answered, his voice thick with emotion. He lowered his head and kissed her, a kiss that tasted of salt, and storms, and a love that had been strong enough to command the sea and heal a broken king. It was a kiss that promised a lifetime of sunrises after the longest of nights.